Yeah, so we about to get into this, man. So we gonna look at this. It's something that jumped out at me, right? When we look at what has been going on amongst pedophiles and pedophile rings, when you look at the attack on consent, right? A lot of times when we look at these situations, the parents, right, the legal guardians of these children give the consent over to these modeling agencies, in some cases, modeling firms, things of this nature, right? The same way a parent would give the consent for marriage. However, when we look at consent, we must understand that people that look to exploit, that have these pedophilic behaviors, they look to exploit these laws and loopholes to do these certain things. But we must look at the parents. And when we look at the biblical curses, it talks about the hatred of the woman for her own seed that will come from between her legs, right? And when you look at this particular case, when you look at a mother who gives a man who's not the biological father of her child the green light to take her out at midnight, and she's in another hotel, understand what's going on here. You gotta understand before, and many times, many pedophiles or people that look to do this had to travel to Asia, have to travel to countries that did not uh, have consent laws, so that way they could uh, exploit their pleasures or these behaviors. And so when you look at these behaviors and these different things, and you look at the things that these individuals teach, the black woman is God. When you understand the black woman is God that they're referring to is the Virgin Mother, and you understand how many misinterpret the biblical scriptures in reference to a maid into a young woman in the context of her being eligible for marriage at a certain age, use that as a segue or a way to a scapegoat to use that as a way to sleep with underage women, meaning that any woman that has had a period is eligible to be married. So when you come, especially these women that come across these individuals that teach these different things about the black woman as God and her fertility and all, understand it is the pureness of the woman that they seek and desire. It's the Virgin Mother with child, right? When you understand that complex and how these individuals that subscribe to this doctrine, this ideal in reference to the womb fertility and worship the womb fertility, you have to understand how this connects with pedophilia and the current agenda on consent. So we're gonna look at a few things. So when we look at legally, how is consent, especially of a minor given? Parental. So understand contracts, agreements, money exchange. People sell, have children with the intent on selling that children into sex rings, into sex markets, things of that nature. So when you look at parental consent, should be criminal for any parental legal guardian to consent to their underage child to be married, i.e., have sex. That's ideally what parental consent to marriage is for an underage child in this legal capacity, which comes back to the biblical text and saying a woman that young could be married in the proper context of the parental's consent, in the father's consent, not the mother. So when you look at the tradition of marriage, there is a reason why the father, right, in the tradition, even in the heathen tradition of marriage, the father is the one that receives the dowry of virgins, the dowry of these things. So when we look at this in the biblical sense, it was fathers that normally would prostitute their daughters for a contract of purchase, even if they were of underage, because they wanted the purchase that comes from the dowry. So when we look at the Deuteronomical law and how the Mosaic law, the Torah, is forming to make these certain things punishable by death. So when we look at the punishment of these things is death. So this is why it's taken, the misinterpretation is taken because the legal or the considered natural age of that a woman could marry is once she's able to have a child. And marriage and sex is one and the same. So when we look at parental consent in marriage, we must understand how these agencies, these firms, these sex rings use contract law, legal contract consent to exploit underage girls. When you look at Playboy magazines, things of this nature, it is the parents that gave the legal consent for their underage daughters to pose in these magazines that are sex magazines. So when we look at this, we must look at it in context when looking at the law and what the civics that goes behind actions. And when we look at capital punishment, right, being stoned, this is one of those punishments or stonings that would take place for this act, right? So when we look at organizations of modern day organizations, when you look at, it's not just women or male or boys that they come over, it's anyone in this pure form. So we look at NAMBLA and how they use the consent laws as a way to get parental consent to do sex acts with minors and have it legally justified. All right, so we're talking about when we look at the system and how it's all set up, right? Whether it's through the industry, you trying to get on selling your soul, many different ways this shit is looked at. But when you look at these organizations and their agenda is strictly on the consent laws and removing the consent, the need to go through the parental, right? The need to be able for children to willingly give consent. And so when we see women nowadays selling their children into these different sex rings for purchases, when you look outside of our waters, or you go into areas like Asia, or in South America, it's even worse. People are having children with the only intent to put them into the sex market. So this is a lot of the shit that's going on when we look at the pedophile rings, the underground, and how capital businesses benefit, right, off of all of this. So you gotta understand, motherfuckers is paid by these same companies that want to utilize certain people to be the image of the removal of consent, or the loophole, or the finder of opening up or finding the little gap, right, to make. So when you look at foreigners, people that are not from this country, their practices in their country, right, when they come here to America, they can no longer keep those practices, right? They must come if you're in a certain state, under that state's jurisdiction, if the legal age is 18, you must, right? The loophole is if you're not from that area or under that jurisdiction, they have to make you under that. So this is some of the ways with the consent and federal consent forms versus state consent forms, things of these natures. So we're talking about legal instruments dealing with parentals to allow for their children to engage in these markets for whether it's porn, whether it's cam girls, right? You name it. The market this is the market. So you have to feed what the market is. So when you see people that used to be in the industry tell you, "Oh, I can't fuck with it because the market is changing." It used to be grown hoes that was being put into these rings, but now when the market is what it is, you see what I'm saying? The feeding for it doesn't change. So you see legal judges removing laws of consent and then using legal instruments, right, to override state jurisdictions of consent. So this is some of the things that you're going to see take place during these times where we see public health taking over our jurisdiction, right? No longer being able to provide a form of health that we desire, being mandated or forced. So when we look at the takeover of children, right, and how these mandates for the vaccines, things of this nature, or how that's going to be used to come after the children 12 and under, right, to remove them out of households that are unvaccinated or have been confirmed cases of COVID. Let's get those children out of there and understand these markets and what's taking place and where our society is when you see what's taking place with the music industry, right, and its exploitation and sex and attracting young children, right, into this market. Understand why people travel and go to certain locations when they're not from there. Understand why you find people going into Asia, to the Philippines, taking those vacations. These people get paid to risk their name to find and exploit. This is part of the bag for a lot of individuals. They don't care about what is being put into the market because it's all about profit and it's all about feeding what's feeding the market. So these are going to be some of the things we see removed in consent, and parents having a consent to say whether or not their child 12 and under should be vaccinated or not. We're going to see that also be one of the new waves that's going to take place. So be up on legal instruments and how to remove yourself from different jurisdictions to protect you and your families during these particular times, because it is going to be these legal instruments that are going to be used for or against you due to the profit and the feeding of this market that has uh, began to come after the children. So understand everything that's happening with the vaccine mandates and there not being a vaccine for those 12 and under, and how those that have refused to work because of it and can't feed their families, guess what's going to happen to their children, right? That are also unvaccinated. So understand the stage that has been set, right? And why the consent laws and the need to gain profit, material gain, how it has uh, mothers, fathers willing to sell their own given children, sign contracts over for their own children, to be in Nickelodeon, to be, you know what I'm saying, Disney Channel, you name it. You know what I'm saying? All of these things. Once you consent and sign over their likeness and who they are over, and they, you know, you giving the green light to the beast to take over your children. So it's time to be up on the legal instruments and knowing how to legally fight the beast and be physically ready to fight the beast and spiritually fight the beast on all three. You know what I'm saying? Got to be on the beast legally, physically, and spiritually. You know what I'm saying? Peace.